Today we're talking about plant classification. That just means how scientists group living and non-living organisms into groups. One way you can group plants is by how they reproduce. Let's take a look at how plants reproduce. All living things need to reproduce. When we talk about reproduce, what we really mean is making more of their own kind. So here, this big tree, it's going to make more of itself. But the question is, how does it do that? Do all plants reproduce the same way? Let's take a look. Some plants use flowers to reproduce. The flowers on the left are the kind you might see in a field or a forest. The flowers in the middle come from an orange tree. And the flowers on the right are a tiny flower you might see in the grass somewhere. But how do flowers help a plant reproduce? If we take a look at the picture here, we can see that flowers eventually, if they're fertilized, turn into a fruit, and you can see that here. But how does a fruit help a plant reproduce? Let's watch this short video and find out. What you just saw was a flower turning into a fruit. That was actually a young pear fruit. Inside of that fruit are seeds. So that answers the question about how flowers help plants reproduce. Flowers turn into fruit, and inside the fruit are the seeds which will grow into new plants. But not all plants use seeds to reproduce. Let's take a look at some plants that don't use seeds to reproduce. There are two types. There are seed-bearing plants and non-seed-bearing plants. Neither one of these plants has flowers. Let's start with seed-bearing plants. Non-flowering seed-bearing plants, one example is conifers. You might know it better as a pine tree. Pine trees don't have flowers. Instead, they have pine cones. I'm not sure if you know this, but inside of a pine cone, there are actually seeds. Take a look at this picture. When the pine cone is mature, it will open up and release the seeds. Examples of plants that don't have flowers and don't have seeds are ferns, mosses, and lichens. If you've ever taken a look at the back of a fern, you may have seen these little yellowish bumps. Those bumps are something called spores. Spores are used to make new ferns. Spores are kind of like seeds. The difference is plants with seeds get their DNA from two other plants, the male and the female, just like you have DNA from your mom and your dad. A spore is just a copy of one plant, kind of like when a teacher makes a copy of a worksheet. Moss is another example of a plant that uses spores to reproduce. And over here on the right, this is a picture of a lichen. Lichens grow on top of rocks and trees, and it is also a plant that uses spores to reproduce. No seeds, no flowers. Now it's your turn. I want you to answer these three questions in your notebook. Question 1. What do all three types of plants have in common? And when I say three types of plants, I mean flowering plants, non-flowering plants with seeds, and non-flowering plants that use spores. Question 2. Compare and contrast flowering plants and non-flowering plants with cones. Question 3. What do spores and seeds have in common? How are they different? Remember to write your answers in complete sentences.